I've actually drawn a complete blank on this one. Oh, well, I'll move on.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of the Co-Conspirators podcast. I'm your host, Calum, and joining me are my co-hosts, John
Hi, everyone.
and Luke.
Howdy, y'all.
Very appropriate accent for this conspiracy theory. So I'm going to kick things off by just asking a simple question. Right? What springs to mind when I mention the phrase, jet fuel can't melt steel beams?
9/11.
There we go, right in one. It's amazing how the biggest conspiracy theory in the world probably can be boiled down to one phrase.
Pretty mad, to be fair.
Don't forget Bush did 9/11. I
That's
feel like
the
there's a
third
multitude
world.
of phrases.
Yeah, but that's a bit more specific. Jet
Yeah,
fuel
true.
doesn't melt steel beams.
Right.
Bush did 9/11. You can only be talking about one thing.
Regardless of what tagline you'd like to use for 9/11, there are many different aspects to this theory. It's one of the biggest conspiracy theories of all time, with so many potential implications for global politics, as well as the power and influence that governments can hold over their citizens.
It's one of the biggest events of all time, isn't it? Let alone conspiracies.
Absolutely. Actually change the course of global politics.
I mean, I'd say this conspiracy really goes to show like the true powers of conspiracy, because obviously nothing has ever been proven against the US government or anything like
No.
that. But I'd say after 9/11, there was a big decrease in confidence and trust in the government.
I've seen a few places saying that about at least 50% of Americans don't believe the official narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive amount. I think, yeah, the two stats are 50% don't believe the official narrative in 9/11 and 50% don't believe they went to the moon. So we may touch on that in a later episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to unpack with this one, that's for sure. Just out of interest, do any of you have any memories of 9/11, the day it happened? I mean, maybe a little bit before our time, before we could properly be processing what was going on, but do you have any vague recollections?
I have absolutely none. No recollection of it whatsoever.
So I was 4 at the time, and I'd just started primary school in the UK. And it's actually one of my earliest memories, just getting home and my mum telling me about what happened and me not really caring. But
Oblivious to one of the biggest events in global history.
I don't know what her response was. She was hoping you'd respond to that. Bush did it as a 4-year-old.
It could have massive implications for potential war in Afghanistan. Just to start with fighting some foreign policy at 4 years old.
I was ahead of my time.
Yeah, I think mine's a bit of a similar one to Luke's. I distinctly do remember coming home, wanting to watch my cartoons on TV after school, and just being wall-to-wall news coverage. Like, it was only 5 channels back in the day, but each one was just showing pictures of 2 burning towers.
That must have been crazy. Kind of wish I did remember it.
Yeah, it was a big shock, I suppose, just because like my daily routine had been completely flipped on its head and I wasn't quite sure what was going on.
I feel like there's nothing even really too comparable to that in our lifetime either. There's no such like, where were you when this happened moment. I guess coronavirus could be up there, but there's no kind of like trigger switch for that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you think back, suppose maybe the 7/7 bombings, but even then I don't have a distinct memory of where I was when I heard the news for that compared to 9/11.
No, 7/7 didn't have a global impact as much.
Maybe the France ones was in 2016. I mean, I remember where I was then, but I was
I remember being shocked when that happened. Yeah, it's still nowhere near the level, is it?
No, not at all.
Before we get into the conspiracies, I think it is important to recount the official narrative to gain an understanding of what is the most widely accepted course of events. And for our more sceptical listeners, the version of the story that the US government would have you believe. On the 11th of September 2001, 4 planes bound for California were hijacked by a group of 19 al-Qaeda terrorists. At 8:45 on a clear Tuesday morning, an American Airlines Boeing 767 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, near the 80th floor of the 110-story skyscraper. 18 minutes after the first plane hit, a second Boeing 67, United Airlines Flight 175, appeared out of the sky, turning sharply towards the World Trade Center and sliced into the South Tower near the 60th floor, causing a huge explosion. 1 hour after the first crash, at 9:45 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 circled over downtown Washington, D.C. before crashing into the west side of the Pentagon military headquarters. Jet fuel from the Boeing 757 caused a devastating inferno that led to the structural collapse of a portion of the giant concrete building. A 4th plane, United Flight 93, was hijacked 40 minutes after leaving Newark Liberty Airport in New Jersey. Delays in takeoff meant that the passengers learned of the events that were unfolding with the other 3 hijackings. so attempted an insurrection, attacking the cockpit and causing the plane to plummet into a rural field near Shanksville in western Pennsylvania at 10:10 a.m. All 44 people on board were killed. So less than 15 minutes after the terrorists struck the Pentagon, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed in a massive cloud of dust and smoke. The structural steel of the skyscraper, built to withstand winds in excess of 200 miles per hour and a large conventional fire, could not withstand the tremendous heat generated by the burning jet fuel. Likewise, at 10:30 a.m., the north building of the Twin Towers collapsed. Only 6 people in the World Trade Center towers at the time of their collapse survived. Almost 10,000 others were treated for injuries, many severe. In total, 2,996 people were killed in the 9/11 attacks, including 19 terrorist hijackers aboard the 4 airplanes. Citizens of 78 countries died in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. Among the dead were 343 firefighters, policemen, rescue personnel, and paramedics. But at the Pentagon, 189 people were killed, including 64 on the actual Flight 77. The hijackers were Islamic terrorists from Saudi Arabia and several other Arab nations, reportedly financed by the al-Qaeda terrorist organization of Saudi fugitive Osama bin Laden. They were allegedly acting in retaliation for America's support of Israel, its involvement in the Persian Gulf War, and its continued military presence in the Middle East. Some of the terrorists had lived in the United States for more than a year and had taken flying lessons at American commercial flight schools, while others had slipped into the country in the months before the 11th of September. The 19 terrorists easily smuggled box cutters and knives, also reports of there being mace and other sort of pepper spray type weapons. These were easily smuggled through security at 3 East Coast airports, and they boarded the 4 early morning flights bound for California, chosen because the planes were loaded with fuel for the long transcontinental journey.
I know security obviously tightened a lot after 9/11, but it really does make you question how the hell could they get like knives and stuff on board.
Oh, it was ridiculously lenient before 9/11. Like it's almost unimaginable when you look back. But things like smuggling drugs and stuff like that was so easy. It was a case of bringing on your drugs in just in a box. If you questioned, you just say, yeah, they're vitamins, and they let you straight on. Everyone was so unassuming back then, and it really shook up. They probably just had it down their trousers or something, or in their hand luggage.
So I guess the airport security that we know today really came.
It was basically a massive response to the 9/11.
Because I mean, obviously we've known nothing different, so I wasn't aware it was much more lax. Well, I knew it was more lax, but I didn't realize quite how lax.
It's been previous reports of other bombings on planes and stuff, people being easily able to smuggle homemade bombs on.
It's also the reason you aren't allowed in the cockpit, because if you watch stuff like Home Alone, which happened before 9/11, like it wasn't uncommon for people to be invited into the cockpit to just have a look while they're flying it. But now that's ever since 9/11, you can't do that. You can't even take a child in or whatever.
I suppose that makes a lot of sense, just the risk element.
I think it was literally a case of if you had a young kid and they asked to go in the cockpit, they'd normally be allowed, which seems ridiculous now.
Oh yeah, of course. So the 9/11 Commission report was released on the 22nd of July 2004. It named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the accused mastermind behind 9/11, as the principal architect of the attacks. Mohammed led propaganda operations for al-Qaeda from 1999 to 2001. He was captured on March 1st, 2003 by the Central Intelligence Agency and Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence and interrogated before being imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay detention camp with 4 other accused terrorists charged with 9/11 related war crimes. There's reported use of torture, including waterboarding, during Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's interrogation, which received international attention and potentially draws some of the confessions into question if they were obtained through torture. But in August 2009, so quite recently, a US military court judge in Guantanamo Bay set a trial date for Mohammed and the other 4 men charged with plotting these attacks, which will begin on the 11th of January 2021.
Wow. How can it have taken so long? You can get 25 years for murder, but that would be backdated those 20 years. So imagine if they get out in 5 years. They obviously wouldn't. They'll make an example out of them, give them about a billion years each, but hypothetically.
Respect, you're only getting 25 years for being guilty of orchestrating 9/11.
I just think it's crazy how it's been 20 years since the events and 18 years since they've actually captured him to actually conduct the trial.
I guess they needed evidence. Did you say in 2009 they decided?
2019 they decided.
Oh, 2019. Okay. Yeah, maybe they've only just come across some more substantial.
Yeah, finally managed to get their story in line. All your official reports and narratives being removed from public records and official secrets acts, what have you. All the plotting behind the scenes that goes on with it. It gives rise to all these conspiracy theories. Yeah, so the long-standing outcome from the 9/11 attacks was the Operation Enduring Freedom, the American-led international effort to oust the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and to destroy Osama bin Laden's terrorist network based there. Within 2 months of the first attacks, US forces had effectively removed the Taliban from operational power, but the war continued as they are fighting just constant insurgencies as well as the nature of terrorism. You're not fighting a conventional army. Osama bin Laden remained at large until the 2nd of May 2011, where he was finally tracked down and killed by US forces at his hideout in Abbottabad, Pakistan.
God, was that really 9 years ago? That doesn't seem like that long ago to me.
No, you're right. It does seem like it's a lot longer ago than it actually was. I remember the news reports for that. So.
Oh, yeah. I remember John Cena announcing it to the world. He was legit the first person to announce it.
True all-American hero. What more can you say?
Exactly.
Sorry, what?
John Cena was the first person to announce Bin Laden had been captured. Oh, I'm not even joking.
On where? Just
Live on WWE. He stopped the show, got a microphone and announced it to the crowd. The crowd's going absolute ape shit. There's videos of it on YouTube.
That's really
Think of the audience for wrestling. That's just your prime demographic to announce
exactly.
Osama bin Laden has been killed. So, yeah, the effect of that operation was that Barack Obama announced the beginning of large-scale troop withdrawals from Afghanistan in 2011. So if we get into the first theory, then I think John's going to talk about the destruction of the buildings.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that intro, Calum. I suppose the overall theory that I'm going to go with is that the weapon used to destroy the Twin Towers was actually some sort of unknown technology or like an energy weapon, which sounds far-fetched, I know. There's not a great deal of proof of this being the case. It's more the anomalies in the official story and some of the other alternatives that have been given that have given rise to this theory. So I'll touch on some of the other theories briefly and say why they don't really fit perfectly for 9/11 as well as the official story. So in any sort of investigation, particularly in crime, the order of investigation should always go, what happened? How did it happen? Who did it and why did they do it? People always seem to jump ahead with 9/11 and assume that they already know the what. They know what happened. Planes flew into the buildings and the buildings collapsed. By noon of 9/11, the news everywhere were already telling people exactly who did it as well. So this is nothing short of a conspiracy theory, as by this time no investigation had taken place and there was no real evidence as to what exactly had happened or how it had happened.
Yeah, it was crazy actually that news reporters were saying that bin Laden was the perpetrator before an actual official announcement from the White House.
Yeah, and there'd obviously been no time to... Because for all they know at that time, there could have been bombs planted in it as well. There could have been any manner of things that happened, but they already kind of skipped over that and went straight for the who did it. We need to find somebody to pin this on.
Yeah, I mean, George Bush didn't actually make his official announcement until about 7 o'clock in the evening. He was over in Florida doing presidential duties.
Yeah, he was in a school. There's that famous footage. He was reading a story to the children, and then one of his security guards comes over and whispers in his ear, telling him what had happened. And then he finishes the story and then walks off to another room. Which,
when did al-Qaeda release the video claiming responsibility?
Yeah, not sure. I mean, you would assume it would have been before noon because they're unlikely to have plucked it from nowhere. But it's still strange that they kind of would pin it on them, even if they did claim it. I mean, they claim numerous terrorist attacks all the time when it's actually just somebody acting in their name but has never had any contact or something like that.
Anything to further their agenda, really.
Yeah, well, they always want to seem bigger than they are.
Yeah.
A useful tool is something known as Occam's razor, which looks at the solution that uses the least amount of assumptions. So it basically says, if you want to use gravity, which solution out of these two would you use? There's a force called gravity that pulls you to Earth, or there's a force called gravity that is concocted by angels and demons that are pulling you to Earth as part of their power. You'd always go for the most simple one, the one that uses the least assumptions. Some of the assumptions involved include planes do not cause buildings to disintegrate into dust and fall apart from the top down. There's also numerous assumptions surrounding the competency of the pilots, failings in the US Air Force, and other government failures. Some other kind of theories, such as controlled demolition, that can be ruled out with Occam's razor include the fact that you would have to assume sufficient explosives were placed there before time. They were carried in and set up undetected. The bomb sniffer dogs didn't detect them. Workers didn't notice the installation or any holes in the walls. There was a practical way of igniting them. The explosives were silent and there was no collateral damage to surrounding buildings. There was no significant debris.
So Debbie from accounting just kind of, hang on, there's a bomb under my desk.
So most of the other main theories also share these problems. So one of the main ones that's very popular is thermite, which is used in explosives, I think, but it's categorized by having very intense heat. And there was presence of thermite found on the 9/11 site. It shouldn't really have been there if it was just a plane crash. But this theory can kind of be debunked by the large amounts of paper that were found at the scene that obviously come from like filing cabinets and stuff inside, because they should have been engulfed if the conditions to support thermite were present, because it would have been too hot. Another popular one is it was some sort of miniature nuke. So that can kind of be debunked by the fact that there were plenty of people who didn't suffer burns, or, for example, 14 people walked out of Stairway B with no burns, despite the fact that the nuclear readings that day were significantly higher than normal. Probably isn't something to read too much into, because you would have, if you look at Chernobyl, there was nobody on site there that wasn't burned and kind of walked away unscathed, whereas there was 9/11.
Real weird birth defects in the hospitals, months after.
Exactly.
From any extensive radiation.
Yeah, growing 4 farms and all that. So one of the issues, I suppose, with being a conspiracist with 9/11 is the way the burden of proof sits. So if I were to tell you today that I ran 50 miles in 2 minutes, your proof that I did not do this would not have to be complicated. You could say the world record for 1 mile is around 3 minutes 43 seconds. The point being, you wouldn't have to prove exactly how long it should have taken me to run that far, or how much longer I would have taken if I ran the 50 miles around a different route. You need only point out that my story was physically impossible. Yet whenever anyone questions the 9/11 official story, they're asked to provide every last piece of detail.
Yeah, so that's one of the things with a conspiracy theory is, especially with 9/11s, you're instantly dismissed when you have any question the official narrative, especially when you're dealing with the ones who have been in control of said narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the way that analogy kind of works is, if you say to somebody, I don't think those towers should have fallen that way, they will then come back and say, well, how should it have been done and all this. Whereas if you've seen proof in maths or whatever, or like science, that they just shouldn't have fallen that way, in a normal case, that would be enough. But people always want that burden of proof to lie with the people questioning it.
It's just an easy way to, say, discredit people who are questioning things, isn't it, though?
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of attitude is much the case with the 9/11 pancake theory, which is the official story that we're given as an explanation of the collapse. So for those of you who don't know what the pancake theory is, it basically goes that once one floor fails, it then falls down, hits another floor, and then using that momentum, that floor then fails, and then they move down onto the next floor and onto the next floor, so on and so forth. So as soon as the top floor fails, it comes down, brings the rest with them. So these 110 floors, which were in the towers, would gather momentum and take each other out one by one until the entire tower had collapsed, which is kind of how they do it in controlled demolitions. However, if you work it out for the towers, this should actually take around 97 seconds for the towers to collapse completely. And this isn't even taking into account air resistance, which would slow it down again. Free fall speed from that height is 9.055 seconds. A billiard ball would fall the distance in about 9.22 seconds, and the towers fell in just under 10 seconds, which is calculated using an average from 3 official accounts, including the 9/11 Commission, who had it, I think, 9.8 seconds. So in this time, just under 10 seconds, 110 floors fell. So if you can imagine the pancake theory, to kind of demonstrate this, if I got you to clap your hands as many times as you could in 9.8, call it 10 seconds, you might do 30, 40, maybe 50 claps. You wouldn't get anywhere near 110. Yet they're kind of asking you to believe that more times than you can clap your hands, this is how many times floors are being crushed. Bearing in mind they're all kind of steel reinforced.
I guess it's just the sheer weight of the thing. They would fall a lot quicker than, what you'd expect. Nothing this big has ever fallen in history, so for something so big and so heavy to fall, it would probably break any records.
Well, you can say that to some extent. You may not know exactly, but using like other buildings that have been demolished and other things, like I said earlier, they worked out that using pancake theory, it probably should have taken about 97 seconds rather than, it took 10 times less. And these 110 floors were around 12 feet apart each, and they had to be continually destroyed in fractions of a second, as if they put up no resistance whatsoever and were almost completely hollow. Calculations suggest that even if 9 out of every 10 floors were missing, towers would still take around 31 seconds to fall from roof to ground. Pancake theory would also result in a large accumulation of floors stacked on top of each other at the base once the tower had fallen. So you'd kind of expect all the floors to stack up on each other, and you could see the floors stacked up. And there's plenty of pictures of that from actual times when towers have fallen and controlled demolitions where all the stuff around the core is gone, but those main floors are kind of stacked up. But in actuality, there's very little rubble on 9/11, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust, prompting eyewitnesses and police, even news reporters, to ask, where did the towers go? The building was being pulverized as it fell. It was turning into dust. When the building had fallen to half its height, there was actually no debris other than dust. Now, to get a bit sciencey, kinetic energy can only be spent one way. So it was either being used to pancake the floors down into each other, as we're told, or it was being used to pulverize a structure into dust, not both. Pancaked collapse is physically impossible, and in short, the collision of a plane into the towers could not cause them to collapse so rapidly and so completely.
So when was the plane supposed to have flown directly all the way through the tower? My first thoughts about 9/11, I thought the plane sort of gets stuck halfway through.
Yeah, I think it does, because you see the nose come out, but you don't see anything else. So it did settle in there. Again, as the towers fall down, that's even more added resistance that there's a plane in the way, even if it takes out, say, 3 floors with it.
Yeah, and plus
so we're 12 feet apart, these floors, and your average plane's only maybe 20 feet tall.
Yeah, I'd say plus you've got the fact that there's 30 floors above where the actual plane impacted being remain a little bit more intact and just they're not pancaking down on themselves either.
Yeah, exactly. Until they did. So yeah, a possible alternative explanation for the collapse of the building comes in the form of an energy weapon. Now, as far-fetched as this seems, it has a few unlikely supporters, one in the form of the famous 9/11 jumpers. So these were people who actually jumped out of, quite tragically, were forced to jump out of the building for numerous reasons, and there's a lot of quite harrowing photographs of this happening. But the interesting to note is many of these jumpers did not look like they had jumped by choice. They weren't clutching photos of loved ones or any belongings. They have the look of someone surprised to find themselves falling, as if they had been pushed or launched out of the window.
So you're suggesting that an energy weapon has just that the shockwave that is just from that you're off you go
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'll touch a bit more on the jumpers now. So
it does seem so strange that, I mean, obviously in that situation you don't know what the hell you're going to do, but it does seem strange to just jump out the window and, I mean, die in such a horrific fashion. I mean, I guess if you followed the official theory, the rationale behind it would be probably to avoid burning alive, or they've witnessed other people in the room, I don't know, dying painfully, and they just want to get it over quickly.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you jump, you know it's certain death.
That's the thing, because the whole building wasn't engulfed in an inferno.
No, it wasn't.
There was just the smoke was coming out of the place where the plane impacted.
Yeah, there was only the real fires were at the point of impact. Above and below were largely fine until it collapsed. So adding a bit more weight to kind of this theory that maybe they didn't jump out of choice is an image of a man falling from one of the towers. Now, the photo depicts him in line with the 45th floor, and he's around 100 feet away from the building. Now, if you think about this, the world record for a running long jump is around 29 feet, and it is impossible, even if he jumped from the top floor, to have been this distance from the edge by the 45th floor, even if he had a 10-mile-an-hour run-up and jumped a world record distance. This would be made even more impossible because the smoke shows the wind to be blowing in a way that would pull this jumper towards the building, not away from it. Also, if you want to bear in mind, he probably would have jumped because he was either too hot, so he couldn't have had a run-up, or he might have even fallen out of the window due to smoke inhalation and confusion. The fact he would be able to jump so far and get so far away from the building becomes even harder to explain.
It's one hell of a fall.
No, I know.
I just wish I was very well versed in physics, because everything about this just seems to be completely defying the laws of physics.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of issues. I mean, there's someone called Judy Wood who's done a lot of this research, but she is a physicist by trade, BSc, MSc, PhD, and when she described when she watched the live footage on the news, she actually started laughing because she thought it was a joke, because she said it looked so wrong, it broke every rule of physics, that she thought, well, it couldn't possibly be real. It was only when the people around us kind of said, no, this is real, that she realised the severity, and then she wanted to research it and basically prove that everything we're told couldn't have been the exact truth.
It's just so unprecedented. But I think the problem with something like that, you mentioned the jumper was 100 feet away from the building, is just how easily photos are doctored, and so credibility of that evidence can just be taken away.
True. I mean, this photo was like one of the main ones. It's one of the most famous pictures because you can see him very clearly, and I think it was used on the news. But I suppose it could have been doctored by government or whatever. It's always difficult because you can always bring up that argument. People bring up the argument about 9/11 and say, that it never actually happened or whatever. There was never any planes. Just because you can alter footage, if you weren't there to see it yourself, you'll never know for sure. As unlikely as that would seem.
Is there any description as to why it was so few people that went flying out the window then?
Well, I'll kind of get onto that. So another example of a jumper was somebody called Elaine Gentile, and she was on the 97th floor of the second tower when the plane hit. And she called her husband at the time to say that she had wrapped wet clothes around herself and was going to try and run for the stairs, and that she'd call him when she got down. So at this moment, she believed it was very much possible. It sounded like on her phone call that it was hot, but there were no immediate fires around her, and she was quite confident in being able to just get down the stairs and get out. However, sadly, she ended up being one of the jumpers and was found on the streets. Now, Jack, her husband, believes she had absolutely no intention of dying and would not have jumped. So it begs the question, did she fall or was she pushed by something? Now, these two examples and countless others seem to suggest that maybe a force or energy may have propelled these jumpers out of the window against their control. Interestingly, people were seen disrobing whilst hanging out of the side of the burning building. This is clearly an odd response, particularly especially if your kind of clothes were wet, they could provide a protective layer against the flames. So why were they being so desperately stripped off? I mean, if you're in a fire, you wouldn't just suddenly take all your clothes off because you were hot. They're going to provide some sort of protection, if anything.
Wouldn't you?
Well, I wouldn't. You might.
Yeah, the risk of a tragedy, if I had one chance to have chances to flaunt it, Put it on the news as well, aren't you?
Reminds me of that Frankie Boyle joke. I don't know if you've heard it, when he was talking about Tom Daley and how he was getting so much praise for being one of the best divers in the world and how his dive was incredibly difficult. And then Frankie Boyle just says, 9/11, that was a difficult dive.
Tom Daley didn't have the assistance of energy weapons.
Well, exactly. He was diving out of choice. So yeah, the fact that people were disrobing and quite frantically as well, you can see them literally hanging onto the edge of a building where if it was that hot inside, you would think that the metal beams and stuff, the structure on the outside would be absolutely roasting hot as well, and you wouldn't be able to just hang off them. But people were seen hanging out the window, taking their clothes off. So this has led some theorists to believe that perhaps some sort of radiation or microwave was used as part of the attack on the towers, because wet clothes would intensify pain caused by microwaves and energy beams. If you think of how water reacts in a microwave, it suddenly starts to boil and get incredibly hot and it moves around a lot. So perhaps there was actually an energy weapon directed at the building, which would explain to some extent this response. The number of reported jumpers from witnesses is also a lot higher than you might expect. Firefighters on the scene described it as raining people, with people hitting the ground about every 5 seconds.
Jesus.
Awful sight that would have been.
Not paint a pleasant image.
No, it sounds like one of the worst things you could ever experience. And a firefighter actually died being hit by a jumper as well. He was on the ground and...
What a way to go.
Oh no. Working this out, it would equate to over 1,600 people died from jumping alone. Only 1,594 victims are ever identified from DNA in total. So the number of people that jumped couldn't explain everybody that was identified from DNA. Which begs the question, such an odd thing to do would be to jump. Why were so many people doing it? Just bringing it back a little bit to the pancaking thing. The towers sat very close to the bedrock next to the Hudson River. And this is something that before this, I'd never even heard anyone mention. But had the full force of the towers hit the ground, as the pancake theory would suggest, they would have shattered that bedrock and caused the river to flood the city. This is due to Newton's first law, which states that the forces supporting the column would be equal to the forces impacting the ground. So it would have been like hammering a 500,000-ton nail into the bedrock as those towers collapsed. A possible explanation for as to why this didn't happen and it wasn't flooded is because the majority of the towers actually didn't hit the ground, as the pancake theory suggests they would have. In fact, they actually seemed to turn to dust in midair before they'd even hit anything. The towers didn't collapse, they were destroyed from the top down. The magnitude on the Richter scale from each tower should have been over 4, given their height and weight, but actually only registered at a peak of 2.1 for just 8 seconds. Which indicates that surely they weren't destroyed with conventional means and didn't hit the ground as a full tower, as a normal collapse. A not particularly similar building, but the Seattle King Dome, which is basically like a big dome building, collapsed and had a magnitude on the scale of 2.3, so 0.2 higher on the Richter scale. Yeah, it was 30 times smaller and had 30 times less potential energy than each tower, due to its far smaller weight and height.
That's pretty compelling then, I think. You think of all the material that goes into building that just to almost like be vaporized.
Yeah, if you look at it with that perspective, it is very odd. So the buildings just turned to dust as they fell, and the building simply would not have had enough kinetic energy to dustify itself floor by floor, eject massive plumes of dust and debris, and overturn cars and other ground vehicles. Yet somehow it did. So on the subject of cars, they're another interesting yet very rarely discussed anomaly. 1,400 toasted cars were littered about the site. They had wilted due to high heat, and there's plenty of cars that were basically on fire or had been burnt up. Yet they had some parts of the cars that were completely unscathed. And there were also pictures of cars that were on fire and had been completely almost melted, but they had pieces of paper right next to them that were completely fine, which seems to suggest that it can't have been due to the high heat in the area that the cars were burning. It was something else. It was as if the metallic parts of the cars were targeted, but the rest was fine. So I've got a few pictures of cars where they've kind of stopped halfway, so they're completely burnt up to a point, and then they're completely fine after that point, as if it was kind of on the boundary of where this energy weapon might have been targeted.
Oh, right.
And it's also only the metal that's ever burnt. The interiors are completely fine. They're not burnt at all, whereas a seat would burn a lot quicker than a metal exterior.
This is probably a stupid question, but what temperature would paper burn at? Because I'm assuming it's a lot lower than metal, but just from pure heat alone, would paper just start burning up?
Well, it would if it got to a certain heat. It would have to be very hot. But there were these kind of dust clouds and waves, and it would beg the same question: well, why did the car set on fire in the first place? Because the cars obviously weren't hit by fire. They were completely burnt to a crisp. So there's not really an official explanation as to why 1,400 cars were burnt in the afternoon.
I mean, this is the first time I've ever heard anything about the cars being talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
In context to 9/11, with first responders, did they notice any extreme heat or radiation or anything when they were getting to the scene or on the scene? Are they assuming that they've got there after, say, maybe said energy weapon, if you'd believe this theory, was to have gone off? Do you think they would have noticed any sort of residual heat or anything like that?
Well, I suppose if you think of it, I mean, a lot of them died on the way in, and a lot of them suffered serious burns. But I suppose if you think of it like a microwave, if you turn your microwave on and then turn it off, open the door, put your hand in, it has dissipated quite quickly. The actual area isn't that hot anymore. So I'm wondering, I mean, I don't know everything about it, but I'm wondering whether after that just initial pulse that just shocked everything in the area, whether it's then goes back to normal quite quickly. But on the subject of cars and witnesses, one of the policemen on the scene had a very strange experience because there were actually a lot of cars found upside down around the 9/11 site. So one of the witnesses, a policeman, recalls being picked up and lifted in his police car several feet and flipped over. Now, this was explained due to gusts of wind caused by the impact, which, I mean, that would have to be a pretty serious gust to lift you anyway.
Oh, yeah, like
To lift a
tornado
car.
level with
But
gusts
to
of wind.
disprove that theory even further, he said one of the strangest things he noticed, there's plenty of pictures of this, is when he got out of the car, all the leaves were still on the trees. They hadn't been blown off. So if you think of a high gust of wind, high enough to lift a car, I think it's going to blow a few leaves off a tree.
Oh, definitely.
Which again suggests that
Yes,
maybe a
yeah.
gust of wind isn't the explanation for this. So no one was reported to have been burnt in the dust cloud that engulfed the city, and there were no piles of burning bodies. Trees did not burn up, yet all the cars did. There was so much paper on the ground from the building that the firefighters thought it was snow. But why wasn't that burning if cars and stop signs all around it were? Transcripts of emergency calls emphasise the intense heat in the area, but they also state they can't see any sign of a fire other than the one on the in the midsection of the second tower. Could this actually be some sort of radiation they were feeling? An interesting theory involves what's known as the Tesla-Hutchinson effect. Have either of you heard of this?
No, I've not. I'm very interested to find out because this theory just gets stranger and stranger, like just going further and further away from its official narrative to the point where it just cannot be explained really by the science that we've become accustomed to. Especially
Exactly.
at the time as well.
So yeah, the Tesla-Hutchinson effect is when a specific frequency, like a radio frequency of waves, can have incredible effects on metals that include, somewhat incredibly, levitation, melting of parts of metal, fusion of dissimilar materials, e.g. fusing metal and wood together, spontaneous fracturing of metals, and changes to structure of an object. So the physicist Hutchinson experienced this effect when he activated a Tesla coil and a static electricity generator in the same room. Twice he felt himself get hit by a piece of metal that had levitated itself across the room, and he also noticed that the metal in his room had started welding and bending. The effects of this phenomenon were seen at 9/11. Beams bent in strange ways as if turning to jelly, intense heat but no real obvious signs of fire, woods and metal were found fused together, cars were lifted from the ground, and metal on cars and signs burnt in very specific places. This theory concludes that some sort of energy weapon utilized this effect in order to specifically target the two towers and destroy them in a way that would not cause New York City to flood or cause any unnecessary damage to most of the civilians or surrounding buildings. Well, that about sums it up. So what do you think?
You just don't know where to go with this one. It just seems like science can't explain, apart from this Tesla Hutchinson effect. But just you think the mechanics of actually trying to get said energy weapon into the building, like it's the same argument with controlled demolition or something.
I think
Surely
it wasn't
somewhere-
in the building. I think what they're saying is it was basically a beam was fired onto these buildings from somewhere
suppose-
else.
So that's the question. Where? That's we just because from everything you've said, it does not align anywhere near with the narrative. It does not seem possible with say how the faster building fell, the fact that paper wasn't burning, but cars are completely warped, getting flipped over. It's one of those ones I don't know where the actual official explanation lies, but it's just something about it just does not add up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the difficulty with this, the person who's kind of come up with this theory, her main job and what she set out to do was just to poke holes in the official one and say, this can't be explained, this can't be explained, this can't be explained, etc. And then I think she was pressured to come up with a theory. And so she looked into it, saw the similarities with the Taylor Hutchinson effect, and kind of thought, well, it must have been some sort of weapon that has utilized that effect. It's given off a lot of the symptoms of radiation burns, so it must be something to do with that. So that's almost this kind of side note to what our actual work was.
So that's the thing. If you just mention, like, say, energy weapon or something, that instantly just sort of sets alarm bells off. Just think that's, oh, it's so implausible. It's so ridiculous. It's so hard to rationalize. Like the use of, even say things like EMP blasts exist, and they've existed for a few years now. They use also rail guns, things like that. As in military technology, there's definitely a lot they've been experimenting with that the public are completely oblivious to.
Yeah, exactly. Luke, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely got some solid explanations to it, and it's such, obviously, an unprecedented event that's never happened before and will never happen again. That, I mean, we just can't be 100% certain whether the official narrative is true or not, which is why a lot of these theories spawn out of nowhere. I feel like this specific energy weapon theory is definitely interesting. The only issues lie in the credibility of some of the stories and whether they can be trusted and stuff like that. However, you do feel in response to the cars and stuff, the official narrative definitely doesn't explain it very well. I liked the whole Occam Razors part, but I feel like at the same time, this theory is kind of based on a lot of assumptions as well. So you could argue it falls apart there a bit. It's just interesting to think of what the rationale behind using an energy weapon would be, whether you want to go down the line, it was done to turn opinion against the Middle East. As much as you don't like to think it's plausible that a kind of like head of the government could get together and plan something like this, I mean, we know throughout history that people in power often do ridiculous, unheard of, and outrageous things, so you can never rule it out, really.
Yeah, following on from that, you'd think just the fact that a plane being hijacked by supposed terrorists crashing into a Twin Tower would be enough to sway public opinion without having to absolutely raise the area with an energy weapon and just ensure that the towers come down completely.
So I think the theory states the plane crash and everything did still happen, but that was all for the spectators kind of thing to watch. That was where everyone's attention would be. And then actually behind the scenes, they'd fire in this invisible thing because they knew that the planes alone wouldn't bring down the towers in a way that wouldn't bring them down at all. But then also, like a controlled demolition as an alternative might have impacted some of the surrounding buildings. Whereas this was a way to kind of get it to fall on itself with minimal-ish damage.
Just like for the symbolism of it, just having that defining image, just to really cement it in the public opinion.
Yeah, well, so you've still got someone to blame, because if they were to come out and say, al-Qaeda hit us with an energy weapon, I think everyone would go into absolute frenzy. Whereas at least it feels a bit more like you can control it if it's just they've hijacked a plane and flown it into you.
I think the thing that makes it really compelling for me is the whole jumper thing, especially if that picture isn't doctored. But I mean, obviously you don't know what you'd ever do in a situation like that, but I just seem to think that human instinct, you'd try and do anything you can to survive in that situation, and until the building's fully collapsed. I mean, you think these people would have some kind of hope of escape, because realistically they don't know what's going to happen, they don't know if the building's going to collapse, and if they're on floors where there's not fire, then I just feel like they would try and just wait around and see what happens. But I mean, if there is this force or intense radiation that makes it so unbearably painful to be inside the building, then I guess that makes sense as to why a few people would have flung out the window and also hung out the window as well.
1600 jumped, apparently.
There's a phrase "raining men" comes into.
Yeah.
Should we get into some ratings?
Yeah, please go for it.
35. It's one of those ones. It's so hard to rationalize all the discrepancies in, say, the official narrative, and also just trying to justify the use of America would use an energy weapon on their own building, as well as potentially letting a terrorist attack hijack planes and crash them in as well, just for the spectacle of having the Twin Towers completely eradicated, unless there's other ulterior motives to do with world trade and stuff. You don't. So I've seen stuff about one of the justifications is there's so much missing money that the Pentagon couldn't account for. So maybe a big distraction for that. But this seems like it's been months in the planning, or even months and years, to engineer such a critical strike on one of the most famous buildings in the world at the time. But so going back to this, like, it's just the physics of it, because you say, as you think, you can't break physics.
No.
The rules that bind the universe together. There's the pancake theory that caused the building to fall in 10 seconds when it should have taken 10 times as long. Exactly. It does come down incredibly fast. Like when you look at, say, controlled demolitions.
It's as if it's completely hollow. There's no doubt about that. So suppose this theory is saying that the strike actually just vaporized the tower.
Tower of that height, the structural integrity that's going to be able to withstand 200-mile-an-hour gusts of wind, etc. A plane has gone into it and it hasn't instantly crumbled from a plane hitting it at 500 miles an hour.
No, it took a further hour and is it about 102 minutes?
15 minutes after the planes hit the Pentagon at 10 o'clock.
So I think this theory would be saying planes happened as a distraction, and then on that hour and 42 mark, that's when the beam struck, I suppose.
Maybe the building was just hollow. I mean, has anyone ever seen floors 30 to 80?
I've never been in.
Looking at the lift, your first day on the job, right? So you got floor 30. Oh no, there's 81, right? What about the middle field? Oh, don't worry, but those are the restricted zones. You're not allowed in there. That's where we've hidden the energy weapon. I was just saying, Phil, I was like, believability is what was the judging yourself as the fact that it was the official narrative isn't true, which I think is 100% believable in my. So I think my overall believability of this one, I'm going to go for a 6.5, just because it's so hard to identify the actual means with which to have caused. There's even, say, mention the physics of this principle.
Yeah.
But for the overall conspiracy, it's getting a solid 9 for me, because this is going to make me think a lot. I really want to do some bit more research into this energy weapon and how it's affected the building structure and to vaporize such a massive thing. Because reports say there was not very much debris compared to what you'd expect to be from a demolition of that size. Yeah,
there was nowhere near. Like, if you took the materials on the ground and tried to build the Twin Towers with them, you wouldn't even get like 15 floors, let alone 100 odd, because it just all turned to dust on its way down, which shouldn't happen. Steel just doesn't just turn to dust. I think the difficulty with this one, in terms of giving it believability, is just the implications, and it's always going to make you a bit more reluctant, because if you accept it as true, you're kind of accepting not only was 9/11 done by, say, the government, but it was also done with a technology
we can't comprehend.
That you couldn't even, you don't even want to think about, and the fact that they would use it on their own people means they could use it on anyone. It's just not a nice thought, which I think puts people off.
Yeah, that explains my 6.5. Just you can't really put it into words, some of the things you're thinking with all this new information that you just unloaded on us.
No, definitely not. Luke, do you want to give it your ratings?
I think it's a great conspiracy, and it really touches on a lot of kind of holes that can be picked at in the official narrative. I mean, it's got a bit of everything as well. One issue that I do have with the conspiracy in general, and might bring its believability down or not, it depends how you want to look at it, is we say that this whole thing is defying physics. This conspiracy is kind of saying that it breaks the law of physics, and because of that, it has to kind of be this electric weapon. But at the same time, this theory uses kinetic energy theory and Newton's first law to prove itself. So I find that a bit ironic in a way. But I mean, I guess obviously you can pick and choose which physical theories you want to say are working and have been proven plentiful times. So there's that. I'm going to give it a solid 9 as a conspiracy. I mean, I really liked it. It's a unique look at 9/11 conspiracy theories, and not one that I've ever heard before. And also stuff like the, was it Tesla or Taylor?
Tesla, yeah. As in the Tesla coil that the car company was founded on.
So the Tesla Hutchins theories, I mean, very, very interesting to me. But at the same time, again, it's one of them physical theories that are being used when we're disproving other physical theories. But I mean, having been to the 9/11 museum and seen how the beams kind of bend, it seems very, very unnatural, and it just makes you wonder what kind of presence can do that. In terms of believability, I do find the official narrative to be quite believable in the sense of the whole terrorist attack and stuff. And the thing for me that really opened my eyes was the issue with the rubble and the dust you mentioned.
Yeah.
Me, that does seem really strange, and it's really kind of got me questioning it a bit more than I previously had done. So in that respect, I find the official narrative a little less believable, but at the same time, I'm not too convinced on the whole electro weapon. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 on believability. Not quite as keen as Calum, but I really enjoyed it. So thanks for that.
No, you're welcome. I think one thing I'll just touch on before I go into my ratings, that the thing with the whole scientific and physics theories was saying that Newton's first law should always stand. Had the towers pancake normally, i.e. the force of the towers being held up would be equal to the force of the towers that slammed into the ground. But this clearly couldn't have been the case. If you use Newton's laws and use the laws of kinetic energy, that means that the official explanation doesn't hold up because it contradicts these laws. So it's not saying that as a result it must be this theory. It's just saying that if you look at it in terms of physics, the official story doesn't work out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If I had to rate myself, really enjoyed looking into this one. Found it fascinating. I really like the stuff about like levitating cars, which is such a weird thing. It makes you think of like magnets, I suppose, that can kind of make stuff levitate. You know, when it's been explained away as, oh, it was just gusts of wind. Those would be ridiculously powerful gusts of wind. And when have you ever heard of a demolition site causing cars to go flying around? The leaves staying on the trees.
Incredibly localized gusts of wind as well.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I found that bit really compelling. And the fact that it was almost as if some cars sat on the boundary of this radiation because they were kind of burnt up to a point and then it very abruptly stopped and they were completely normal after that point, which I found was cool. Yeah, everything about it, the jumpers was very interesting. How some of them looked as if they must have been launched rather than jumped because they were so far away from the building. So yeah, I'm going to give it over a 9.5. Really enjoyed this one. In terms of believability, I think you kind of have to split it up because I think in terms of, like Calum did, in terms of rating the theory, in terms of disproving some of the others, and I think it's right up there with a kind of 9 or 10. But when you split it out to the crux of it, which I think the person who came up with the theory was kind of pushed into coming up with an explanation when perhaps she wasn't completely sold on one. I think she used the Tesla Hutchinson part to say, well, the 9/11 site was exhibiting all the signs of this, which means some sort of radiation and various types of ways interacting with each other could have been used, rather than saying this is definitely what happened. And to this day, she didn't say this is definitely what happened. She's more about discussing like where did the towers go, why were the circumstances so weird. So yeah, for the energy weapon, I might go for a 5. I think if you want to say that it was government orchestrated, like a lot of people do, it isn't too much of a leap to say that they would use some sort of dark technology to do it. So yeah, I think I'll go believability, maybe a 5. Are we moving over to Calum for his next one?
Yep, indeed. So thanks for that, John. That was very riveting stuff, actually. I learnt a lot there, I think. I was just basically maybe even more confused as to what narrative to believe, that's for sure. So my theory might be seen as a bit of a regression from the grand master plan that John presented. Powerful energy weapons. But it does sort of follow the same lines as every 9/11 conspiracy theory, that the US government was responsible in one way or another. And with my theory discussing the possibility that the US government was aware of the attack that was planned for the 11th of September, and that specific inaction and action ensured that the attacks were allowed to take place successfully. There's been much speculation about the motives for allowing such a devastating attack to go ahead, from being a globalist plot to usher in a new world order, to being a neoconservative move to expand the territory and influence of Israel. However, the main line of thought is that the 9/11 attacks gave the Bush administration the perfect excuse to invade Iraq in order to establish American dominance, get oil, and to vindicate the first Bush presidency's defense of Kuwait in the 1990s during the first Persian Gulf War. Immediately following the attacks, President George W. Bush stated that nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government, can envisage flying airplanes into buildings. These sentiments were echoed by National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who claimed that no one could have predicted that they had tried to use an airplane as a missile. An Air Force general called the attack something we had never seen before, something we had never even thought of. And a few days after the attacks, FBI Director Robert Mueller announced there was no warning signs that I'm aware of that would indicate this type of operation in the country. However, evidence suggests that the FBI, CIA, and executive branch would have all been aware of the possibility for airplanes to be hijacked and turned into weapons following the foiling of the Bajinka plot in 1995. This plot was a large-scale three-phase terrorist attack planned by Ramzi Youssef and the aforementioned Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the same person was believed to have masterminded the 9/11 plots. Just to go into the details of this plot briefly, the two terrorists planned to assassinate Pope John Paul II, blow up 11 airliners in flight from Asia to the United States, and crash a plane into the headquarters of the CIA in Fairfax County, Virginia. However, the plot was disrupted after a chemical fire drew the attention of the Philippine National Police. Yusuf and Mohammed were unable to stage any of the three attacks. One fatality resulted from a test bomb planted by Yusuf on a Philippines air flight, which killed 1 and injured 10.
Why do they still manage to get bombs on planes?
This was conducted in
Before
1995.
9/11.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, they basically tried to explain it away why they weren't stopped, didn't they? By saying, "Oh, it was beyond our wildest dreams that they would ever think of doing this." And now you find out that they've forward previous attempts to do the very same.
Goes even further than that. I mean, what might appear to be a contradiction to these statements, the official narrative has always maintained that the US administration knew a terrorist attack was imminent, but did not have the specifics pertaining to the time, place, or manner of attack. However, this has been shown to be completely false. The joint inquiry into the intelligence community activities before and after 9/11 revealed that there had been a flood of warnings about possible terror attacks in the United States, some using airplanes as weapons. Such warnings were as specific as a 1998 report that warned US aviation authorities that al-Qaeda, I quote, could seek to hijack a commercial air jet and slam it into a US landmark. British intelligence and MI6 had also echoed similar warnings about al-Qaeda up to 2 years before 9/11 and gave a categorical warning to Bush to expect multiple airline hijackings just 1 month before the events unfolded. Even Russian President Vladimir Putin had said publicly that Russian intelligence had warned the US that, quote, suicide pilots were training for attacks on US targets. Is it any coincidence that the head of the FBI at the time, an Attorney General, John Ashcroft, was advised to avoid commercial air travel as early as 6 weeks before 9/11, where he attended all of his engagements via private jets?
I feel like there's so many instances like this where things were just totally ignored and don't come out until kind of after the event. Like with the George Bush thing, he just didn't think it was physically possible this could ever happen, but he had been training before and stuff like that. But I feel like there's just so many of the ridiculous cases that you just put them down to like, I mean, it's impossible, it's never going to happen, and every now and then one comes true and you look like a bit of an idiot. So.
It's almost like a situation almost like Schrodinger's bin Laden. He's simultaneously a criminal mastermind, but he's also a hermit living in a cave in Afghanistan.
Dialysis for 20 years.
Exactly, but he's able to finance these massive terrorist operations, but being impossible to find. And also the thing of he's getting younger in all of his appearances somehow. So it's just
These images are really odd.
A perfect bogeyman. Alongside this evidence of warnings from other intelligence services, the Pentagon had been the focus of drills simulating potential disaster scenarios. The Pentagon Mass Casualty Project involved emergency response teams, members of the Defense Protective Services, and US government officials conducting emergency simulations in preparation for a possible plane crash into the building. Well, in April 2001, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, ran a war game in which the Pentagon was to become incapacitated. A NORAD planner proposed a simulated crash of a hijacked foreign commercial airline into the Pentagon, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff rejected the scenario. It was too unrealistic. I mean, that also reminds me of what I was going to say, that I suppose George Bush's comments immediately after 9/11 could have maybe just heat of the moment things, there's no way we could have expected an event like this. Just trying to almost deflect a little bit. Just you haven't really had time to process what's gone on. You don't really want to think back to all those probable security briefings you think you would have got, but you don't know how the chain of command works. Sometimes these things are just sitting on desks. I don't know.
I guess it's just one of them things you kind of assume that even though there's plans and stuff, you just kind of got it under wraps and you'll foil anything if it ever happens. And so I guess one of the biggest mishaps was not shoring up their own personal security. I mean, obviously it could happen if a plane came from anywhere, but you think these kind of reports would make George Bush do something about airport security in his own country.
Yes, well, I think you say hold that thought. There's been lots that's come out in relating to the poor response. We're saying maybe chronic failings throughout chain of command.
Just kind of on one of the points, just the fact that George Bush is saying it was just so unimaginable that a plane could be used as a weapon. But the towers themselves, I mean, it doesn't really prove anything, but the towers were actually built, and quite ironically, almost like the Titanic, were described as being plane crash proof when they were built, which if it was that unlikely a plane would crash into them and would be used as a weapon, you wouldn't feel the need to say that. I mean, they could have just been saying it as kind of bigging it up and saying, yeah, just how strong they were or whatever. But I mean, if they were possibly anticipating just a normal plane maybe crashing into them by accident, it's not beyond the realms of possibility one could be used to intentionally crash into them. He's describing it as if it was as unlikely as maybe the energy weapon theory, when in actual fact, I mean, it's just flying a plane into a building. It's not.
Yeah, if you maybe boil it down and think, the likelihood of someone being able to hijack a plane, piloting it without, say, external interference from fighter jets or whatever, means notice the plane's gone way off course, crash it into the building. How are they going to manage that and sort of maybe dismiss it on that?
It doesn't even have to be all that, does it? Because there's been numerous occasions where you just get a disgruntled or suicidal pilot by trade who is flying their plane as part of their job, locks somebody else out or kills their co-pilot and then crashes it into something.
Oh, yeah.
So for them to say, that somebody using the plane as a weapon is totally beyond the realms of possibility, I think it's a very odd thing to say, and it's clearly not true.
Okay, well, back to the topic of air security. So I'm talking about NORAD. Evidence alleged that the US air defense units would have been prepared for an attack in the style of 9/11, having simulated various exercises that involved hijacked airliners being used as weapons to crash into targets on the ground. One such target mentioned in said exercises was in fact the World Trade Center. This allegation, though, was flatly denied by the 9/11 Commission, which asserted several times in their report that, quote, the threat of terrorists hijacking commercial airliners within the United States and using them as guided missiles was not recognized by NORAD before 9/11. Perhaps the most compelling argument in favor of the position that the US government were aware of an imminent attack and allowed it to go ahead in the interest of militaristic expansion in the Middle East is the actions of NORAD on the day of the 11th of September 2001. So just for a little bit of context as to why this is so compelling, the standard protocol for tracking and also dealing with hijacked planes, that responsibility falls on the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, where standard protocol dictates that as soon as a plane deviates from its course, I think it's roughly 8 degrees off its course with no immediate recorrection, operators will contact the plane to try and establish what's going on. In the result of no contact, as is highly likely during a hijacking, the FFA will contact the Pentagon, who will scramble fighter jets. On the day of this attack, NORAD was running between 4 and 10 military exercises, some of which involved false hijacks of commercial airlines. These exercises were run out of Colorado and caused major problems for 2 reasons. Firstly, these exercises meant that a large number of fighter planes were moved to Canada and Alaska. Secondly, the hijacking exercises created a major confusion within the system, where the operators did not know whether they were responding to real-world calls or just a development in the exercise.
One of the air traffic controllers was told that a plane had just flown into the Twin Towers or was about to, and his response was, "Oh, right, is this the drill?"
That does ring a bell. I think that does ring a bell from what the documentary I watched.
Yeah, which kind of adds weight to the fact that there were definitely drills going on, highlighting the exact same thing at the same time, which is a common theme with a lot of these attacks.
Yeah, that's very true. We'll get into that in future episodes.
Yeah.
These simulations reportedly caused jams in communication and confusion trying to scramble aircraft, but these would continue to take place even after the first 2 planes struck their targets. When the fighter jets were eventually cleared for takeoff in response to a plane headed for the Pentagon, they were given false information pertaining to the location of UA-11. This is funny because this was on the plane that had already crashed into one of the Twin Towers. When this mistake was realized, it was too late. The plane had already crashed into the Pentagon. Similar errors were noted during the attempts to intercept Flight 93, where calls were made to several air bases which had no available jets to launch. These war games were finally suspended at 11 minutes past 10 in the morning, 7 minutes after the 4th plane had crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania. Subsequent reports would demonstrate that in the Northeast America, only 4 fighter jets were ready in arms to intercept hijacked airliners on that morning. given all of the information that indicated the possibility of a terrorist attack from the air, surely it would have been sensible to heighten air security measures and ensure that as many fighter jets were on standby as possible around the Washington area. There's also, to add on to this, there's reports of planes coming back from exercises being basically spent, having no weapons available, so there's been no fuel left. It's been useless to try and scramble or to redirect, try and intercept one of the 2 remaining planes after the first 2 hit Twin Towers.
Can you imagine how terrifying that would be as a passenger? So you're aware that your plane's just been hijacked, and then you suddenly see 2 jets pull up either side of you, knowing that either you're going to crash into whatever the target is, or the jets are going to shoot you down before you get there.
It's a horrible situation, but that's the thing, because it's not like a jet pilot can get out of the plane, get into the other cockpit or something like that. So there is generally just 2 options there, like you said: either try and talk them down, or you've got to completely escalate it and minimise the potential risk of casualties.
Yeah, that's literally what they would have tried to do. They would have tried to steer the plane, kind of get either side of it and force the plane to steer over a large area or over the sea or something, and then shoot it down, cause minimum casualties.
Yeah, but terrorists hell-bent on causing maximum destruction probably just ignore that, and
so they just shoot it down where it stood, I guess.
But just saying that, there was also reports of some pilots were, I'm not sure how credible these reports are, but were being told or briefed to kamikaze the actual airliners because there were so little planes available with the weapons after all of these exercises had been taking place across the country.
Bloody hell.
There's just a lot of, say, coincidence, and with this whole theory about messages not being passed along the chain of command effectively, notable members of staff being absent on the day of 9/11, meaning that basically complete rookies were in positions of high power, and that their first day on the jobs were unable to effectively respond to these very stressful calls. I think you're getting told to scramble fighter jets, and you've got no fighter jets to scramble.
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming theme, I think, on that day was just confusion. Like you say, there was just too much going on. There was a real-life thing. There was war games and drills going on. There was people off, huge chains of command where at every level they were asking whether it was a drill or not. Things getting sent to the wrong places. It just seems like, if nothing else, just a catastrophic failure on their side.
So the funny thing is, though, you'd think if it was a catastrophic failure, just a completely innocuous catastrophic failure, there would have been a massive inquiry, plenty of people losing their jobs. In fact, the opposite was the case. So there were several promotions, or people who have been senior positions of power at that time would receive promotions in their career, so a couple of years down the line, into very high positions of extreme power.
Yeah, I mean, it's dodgy, isn't it? Because you'd think, right, this has gone so badly wrong, we've got to do all we can to make sure something like that never happens again. Which you would think would be reassessing who's in charge and getting the people involved on the day demoted or letting them go, not pushing them higher up.
Unless they were just following their orders and they carried out their tasks to the letter of...
Yeah, exactly. Without questioning.
Really just question them, say, your moral compass. You think that these are people's lives you're dealing with, and just try to basically... almost like maintain the chaos rather than establish order, just to keep the drills going so the real world events can unfold as the powers that be would will them, if you believe that the globalists are all behind it. Yeah, any other thoughts on that one? How credible do you think it is?
Overall, or just
overall, I think.
You want the ratings?
Yes, go for it.
All right. So overall, as the theory, I think it's very interesting that it was kind of not so much maybe orchestrated but allowed to happen, certainly, and with the added confusion, I think it begs the question, was there some sort of collusion with al-Qaeda and bin Laden, or was it something they got wind of earlier down the line but thought they could spin to benefit them? So yeah, really interesting theory. I think I'll give it a solid 8.5. I think especially anything 9/11 gets boosted a few ratings just because it was such a big event. It's so interesting even to this day. In terms of believability, like you say, like the war game stuff was something I was kind of briefly aware of already, and I don't know whether you can even call it a coincidence, the fact that they were simulating very similar things happening on the same day, and that they were getting confused whether what was happening was a drill or whether it's real life. And then all the fact that they were then kind of protested their innocence, saying, we just didn't see it coming. Whereas clearly you say very similar had happened a few years before.
Speaking of the protesting their innocence, one of the generals in charge as part of the commission went so far as to say that he believed that the war games actually aided their response to the hijackings, which is just almost complete rubbish given all of the evidence that exists to the contrary.
Well, they would have aided the response if you did them, say, 6 weeks before, at least not simultaneously.
And I think he was trying to argue that the fact they had planes in the air already was useful. Despite the planes were sent to the wrong place. So
exactly.
some of the planes in the air were just ready to go back to base and no weapons, no fuel. It would not have been useful in that situation.
How do you think they determined when you say they went to go and scramble one, then they found out it wasn't hijacked? Is it makes it sound as if it was as easy as if they radio through pilot everything okay, and just picturing a terrorist going, "Yep, everything's good."
Maybe you have to give certain clearance codes or something.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Controllers. But I think the main one is just ignoring the radio completely. That's basically the green light for go. We've got a problem here.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that their plane has done a 180 and is now heading back to
Yeah.
Washington DC or New York.
Yeah, with all that being said, believability. I think I'm going to go quite high. I'm going to go for a 7 out of 10. Believability that it was allowed to happen, at least to some extent.
What about you, Luke?
Yeah, like John mentioned, I mean, it's hard to score a 9/11 conspiracy low, especially when it's one that is so interesting and as detailed as this one. The war games and everything like that, and just like the feeling that the government know what's going on and have kind of let it happen and just trying to figure out why that could be. And as well as that prior plans that the Sheikh, I can't remember his name, Sheikh Mohammed had. So that definitely has the believability as well, but everything kind of pans together. So in terms of like conspiracy, I'm going to give it a 8 out of 10. In terms of believability, I mean, all you hear is these fantastic stories about how brilliant, the American intelligence services are. And for a plan like 9/11 to kind of slip through their fingers seems outrageous in a way, especially when they foiled plans in the past that have come through al-Qaeda. So you'd be very surprised if there wasn't some murmurings of any kind within US intelligence circles on this, because, I mean, I'm not totally aware of the climate pre-9/11, but I remember there was some kind of plane shot down from JFK maybe to Paris in the 90s, and I believe al-Qaeda took credit for that, so they were definitely on the US intelligence.
Oh, definitely. Since the Gulf War, there were some tensions between the Middle East and the US, that's for sure.
I remember Sean Atwood as well saying about this kind of adds to the way that there were maybe murmurs of it happening beforehand when he spoke about like airline shares plummeted the day before 9/11, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Oh, was that your thing? All right, fine.
Literally my theory definitely supports Calum, and for that reason, it maybe makes me believe it a bit more. So in terms of believability, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10.
That's good. I'll take that, because I think this is one aspect of the foreshadowing argument for that the US government was aware of the attacks going on. Because there's so many different elements that would all combine when you take into account all of the intelligence they supposedly received from their allies and even Russia flagging things up. But you think we've got this family began to discuss the hijackers being Saudi nationals entering the US, enrolling into flight school. So they say stuff like trying to asking about flying big jumbo jets when they've just been starting out in the Cessnas. There's just lots of different elements to it. Another one that's kind of strange, I think the guy who's been caught or foiled trying to mastermind an attack 6 years previously is now he's still out roaming without a plot and plan. Seemingly to have got off scot-free from his previous jaunt into airline terrorism. So that's another one that doesn't really get talked about too much.
No, I didn't know that.
The number of planes that weren't available, it seems like, when they did manage to try and scramble jets, they've called around several different airfields to find there was no jets on hand. And so, all this was while time was running out. And by the time they actually found airfields that was ready to scramble, it was too late for the one getting into the Pentagon. But the overall conspiracy theory, I think, just like 9/11. But this one, just to be so egregious in hosting war games the day of the event, it just seems too coincidental to not be like causation. The fact that none of their fighter jets, which are specifically for intercepting hijacked planes, were available. And in the face of all of this mounting evidence, they've denied the fact that they knew. You think it was very likely that a terrorist attack in this form was coming, but just from a range of sources, like through the FBI, CIA as well, for none of it to have been almost taken seriously or to be flat out denied by the commission report, makes the fact that they've wanted to leave or let it go ahead quite believable. So I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10 on believability.
Can I just say, when you talk about the drills and the failings in scrambling the jets in time and stuff,
yeah,
I'm sure I heard it was on Zeitgeist. Can't remember the exact figures, but it was definitely the fact they'd had 0 failings in real life or in war games in the last 10 years. And on the day of 9/11, I think they had something like 7 failing. Could be coincidence. It could just be like a job done awfully. but for there to be that many having had such a flawless record before that is a bit suspicious.
It was a job done awfully, but a job done awfully on one of the most catastrophic events in US history. They've given their almost impeccable record beforehand.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to be continuing on this theory that the government was aware of what was being planned and allowed it to go ahead. I think it's Luke's theory, which we've got coming up next.
Yeah, thanks for that, Calum. So my theory kind of follows on a bit and suggests there was some inside knowledge on the 9/11 attack. And my theory is all about insider trading. Kind of two angles to this. The first angle is there was some inside knowledge, but the other angle is the terrorists themselves were trying to financially profit from the attack by trading right before it happened.
Trading shares.
Trading options, actually.
Right, okay.
I'll go into a bit of detail on the option itself, as I'm sure not everyone's as financially savvy as John and Calum. So.
Yeah. Do you know about options trading, Calum?
I've heard about it, but that's about as far as it goes, as with any sort of stock trading.
All right, fair enough.
Okay, so this theory kind of revolves from unusual trading patterns of put options for airlines just before the 9/11 attack. To be precise, it was trading in United and American Airlines options, which were the two airlines which were involved in the crash. A put option is where you are able to sell a share on a specified date for a specified price, no matter what happens in between then. For a bit of a simpler example that might be easier to understand, I might agree with Calum that I'm going to sell him a PS5 on the 1st of July for £800. If the PS5 crashes in price because it turns out all PS5s are faulty, I can still receive £800 on the 1st of July from Calum, no matter what, because there's an agreement to sell. However, if the PS5 was to go up to £1,500, I don't have to sell it to Calum. I have the option not to do that. So you can see that options can be used to ensure certainty and eliminate any risk. You know exactly how much you're going to get for selling something, and it insures you against adverse price movements while still enabling you to profit from any favorable movements. Options are, however, also used by risk takers who try and speculate or predict the market. Big money can be made with put options, which were the ones used just before 9/11, where a price is agreed, and then before the agreed date, the stock price of the option falls. Talking of which, I think we should all invest in the Joe Rogan podcast because, it won't be long until we overtake them and their podcast dips in value. So you can see why it's very suspicious why so many put options were bought in airline companies just prior to the 9/11 attack. This would kind of signify that people were predicting that airline stocks would plummet. And as you can imagine, the airline industry did heavily plummet just after 9/11, and people who bought put options benefited massively financially from this. This unusual trading activity could suggest somewhere someone knew something was coming. I think most people would argue that the airline industry is always growing and improving, and so it seems odd people would predict it to crash. There's only really a massive major event like coronavirus, 9/11, or the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull erupting.
Oh,
bring
nicely
it down.
done.
That was impressive.
Had to get that one in there. So you can see it's only really a massive, major unpredictable event that can cause airline stock to fall. So it suggests that someone knew something was going to happen. For a bit of further evidence, Bloomberg's Tradebook electronic trading system identified option volume in United Airlines on 16th of August 2001, so just under a month before 9/11, was 36 times higher than usual. Trading is heavily regulated, and the information on who trades what is all out there, and it's very easily traceable. Hence, it might seem weird that the government would do this as they could be caught. This kind of debunks one of the theories that suggests the government planned 9/11 and this unusual trading patterns in put options were their way of trying to recoup the inevitable losses they would suffer financially due to the economic setback from the attack.
I don't think it really debunks it because they could have just got somebody else to buy them, in their name, and then given them the profit. It's unlikely if they were going to do it, they would buy them as the name US government.
That's totally true, but so the SEC, which is the Security and Exchanges Commission, which regulates the financial markets in America, actually got in touch and interviewed people who had been trading in the put options, and they came under pretty heavy interrogation over what they were doing and why they were doing it. Obviously, the SEC is kind of run by the government in a way, and there's a lot of government involvement in that. So, I'm sure you could say that's a conspiracy in itself that the government could get away with any inside trading. So I guess it doesn't totally debunk that kind of side of it. This is all solid fact. All this information is out there and it's provided by Bloomberg. And what's even crazier is that on the 6th of September, 5 days before the attack, the option volume in United stock was nearly 100 times higher than normal. What you could argue, I know.
I thought you were going to say like twice as high or something, not
Yeah,
100 times.
Does that not just make me
I mean,
think they're pushing their luck a bit too much by making it so? Because
Yeah.
surely any trader, no matter how much they know the inside of the government's workings, would notice something doesn't seem quite right with what AP at some stock or worth 100 times
Yeah.
more than it usually is.
I think the thing with this kind of stock is that, as I mentioned, airlines are quite a safe bet, safe investment, as it's only really a major thing that can bring them down. So any investment in the airline industry could massively cause an increase in what's considered normal. But it's just the timing is very, very suspicious. And I mean, what is arguably even more suspicious was it was 100 times higher than normal, but it wasn't loads and loads of people. It was a single US-based investor with no conceivable ties to al-Qaeda, apparently, who purchased 95% of the United Airlines puts on September the 6th. And this same investor, as part of his trading strategy, also bought 115,000 shares of American Airlines on September the 10th, the day before the attack. I mean, that's certainly suspicious. The FBI and the SEC both looked into the issues and found this guy, but they found the links to be innocuous. In the SEC's published report, it's very, very kind of like blasé, and it says, you know, he's not the type of guy that you'd expect to be linked to al-Qaeda, and it's kind of lacking explanation.
So he just basically walks away with an absolute ton of money.
Yeah.
Almost scot-free.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing for me is that it's kind of like, you know, that you can be tracked, so it would be like a massive middle finger up to the system if you know about it, and you know, you're going to hedge your bets against it, knowing that they'll come and find you.
What was the trend like before 9/11? Is it possible they were on the decline anyway, and he thought there might have been a bigger spike just kind of by coincidence because that's what the trends were showing?
So I'm actually going to touch on that next. The guy involved in the trading did give some reasons, and I mean, they are fairly reasonable, but it's still very suspicious. And I mean, the fact that the SEC and the FBI were saying this guy doesn't look like he'd have links to al-Qaeda just based on like his looks alone. I mean, you could argue the government were involved in some way.
Sounds like a very professional investigation, doesn't it? He doesn't look like the type. So
I suppose that you could think if they really went after him, that implied the government knew about 9/11 as well and knew exactly what was going on. So those ones, they sort of had to let him go. They, there's nothing to see here, sort of thing.
Yeah. So this major investor, the SEC, linked back to one US hedge fund, which managed 5.4 billion US dollars. And when questioned, they claimed they believed that airline stocks would fall for a variety of reasons. The reasons listed include recently released on-time departure figures, which suggested the airlines were carrying fewer passengers, and recently disclosed news by American reflecting poor business fundamentals. I guess it is therefore plausible that this investor had no inside knowledge and it was more a savvy business decision. I mean, airlines have obviously collapsed in the past. I can't really remember too many off the top of my head, but I do remember seeing news stories of maybe BMI Baby. Is that one?
Possibly. I mean, you don't have to look very far because they're all collapsing at the moment because of what's going on.
Well, yeah.
So Ryan,
but I mean, that's
getting all the government for introducing a quarantine system that should have been introduced months ago.
We'll leave that for a potential part 3.
Milk that cow.
So they believe the falling passenger numbers would continue into the future, which I do find a bit strange and a bit unlikely, as you'd assume the airline industry is always going to be booming, especially for a company like United Airlines that's such a kind of dominant power.
With options trading as well, though, it's a lot more short term. So I don't think that really kind of stacks up as an excuse. You say, I reckon it's going to fall in the future. It would have to fall in the near future for your exercise date rather than just a gradual trend.
Exactly. That makes this even odder because the guy bought options in United, which, as you mentioned, is short term, and that was kind of solely based on passenger numbers falling. He bought shares in American, and that was because news had shown American had poor business fundamentals. So I guess you can argue that the shares of American are kind of more reasonable. And I mean, I'm not a trading expert, but it seems very, very speculative to invest so much based on these figures alone. But then again, I guess with no risk comes no reward.
Yeah, I mean, it's not out of the question that these top investors do make huge risks. So I suppose he could have made a guess. It just seems like pretty woolly reasoning to have done it.
I guess as well, the thing with an option is there's never too much chance for a massive loss. You obviously pay a premium to take the option out in the first place. If it goes down, the price of the stock goes down, brilliant. You make a lot of money. if the price of the stock goes up, then I mean, you pay the option premium and then you just don't sell stock.
Yeah, you just don't exercise it. All you lose is the
So-
option premium, yeah.
So there's not huge losses that can be made in options. So it is a relatively safe investment in a way.
Yeah,
I guess what I'd also touch on in this is, I mean, history has proven, the LIBOR scandal, the financial crisis, that traders don't always have the best morals at heart. And you probably wouldn't put it past them working with al-Qaeda if al-Qaeda were to contact a hedge fund and wanted some trading done on their behalf to finance a terrorist attack. And so you wouldn't put it past them not to report inside knowledge if they could make money from it.
it was one of the most difficult crimes to prove in the world is
Yeah.
insider trading, because it's just so easy to say, yeah, well, I just did it because I had a hunch, and that can pass most of the time because they've got to prove that you knew about it beforehand.
I mean, one guy alone spent 100 times the normal amount of options on airlines and got away with it because he said it was a hunch. So
Exactly.
yeah. So actually, what is also quite suspicious about the trading patterns is there was very, very small rises over time compared to the normal, followed by the big rises that I've mentioned. Kind of financial analysts have kind of looked at this and they've kind of come up with a theory that the terrorists themselves were trading very small, not to alert any suspicion, but then very, very savvy financial American analysis took the slight increase in put option trading of airlines as a signal that there could be a potential terrorist attack coming, and hence quickly jumped on the case and purchased the options. I mean, you'd have to be very, very eagle-eyed to see this, in my opinion. But there was actually one options newsletter which released on the 10th of September suggesting that people should buy airline options, but with seemingly little evidence to suggest why. So that's definitely kind of adding to that kind of theory.
It's not out of the question. I suppose if they saw a little pattern of people betting against the market, it's not unheard of to use that to explain your own betting, I suppose. But
And I mean, I guess as well, people would look for those patterns full stop.
That's a job.
Yeah, I mean, small rises could easily show that there's some kind of insider knowledge going on somewhere, and you can capitalize on others' inside knowledge by kind of hedging your bets there.
I mean, it's one thing saying this was small rise, then to someone it seems like chucking everything onto these options. Ballsy, you'll say that much if you're going to be completely innocent in this trading. But you have the hunch of a lifetime.
This is coming from Calum, who the day after a student loan drop went down the casino and put it all on red.
It must have been a weird feeling if, say, you were in like your stockbroker's office on 9/11 and you were one of the people who'd bet big on it, and the planes crash and you're like celebrating, but also you're like, oh shit.
I mean, you'd have to celebrate because you were going to come in huge. I think the stocks dropped 40% when trading eventually reopened. So a hell of a lot of money was made by And then kind of also down kind of an insider trading route, but a completely different avenue, was after releasing his book called The Death of Money, where he discussed this insider trading prior to 9/11 that I've just mentioned. James Rickards, the author, was contacted by a former government securities trader. And this guy claimed that a major sovereign wealth fund had called to place an order to buy $2 billion of 2-year treasury notes the day before the attack on September the 10th. For those who don't know, a sovereign wealth fund is one held by the government of a country. And even by the standards of large bank dealers, an order for $2 billion of notes in one transaction is pretty much unheard of.
So is that implying that that's to cover their losses? Or?
Well, you'll find out it's not necessarily an American sovereign wealth fund.
I was going to say, which country do we know?
The Saudis.
So we aren't actually specified with a country, but so I did a little bit of analysis. We were told that the sovereign wealth fund was so large that counterparty credit was not an issue, and the 2 billion trade was executed and settled at the end of the business day. So you can imagine it must be a pretty large sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
The customer was apparently never heard from again. And obviously the next day the attack took place, and the value of the newly purchased 2-year notes soared in the face of geopolitical uncertainty, and the sovereign wealth fund profited massively. Obviously these are just one guy's tales, but I mean, if he's to be believed, is pretty damning. And so the SEC, they don't deal with sovereign wealth fund transactions. And so suspiciously, this case was not investigated and never really in the public eye. And so if you believe this, one country massively benefited from 9/11. So not every country has a sovereign wealth fund. The UK, for example, does not really have one. And I mean, thankfully, you can rule the United Kingdom out of doing this trade. And so for a 2 billion trade not to be a credit issue, you would really have to expect the fund to be huge. And also for the kind of 2 billion trade to be done in one day, it must be a pretty powerful kind of sovereign wealth fund. So there's 15 countries which have funds over $100 billion. But to me, even this seems a bit too small to pass the trade over one day. So I looked at 8 countries that have sovereign wealth funds over 500 billion. So I'd probably argue that one of these is likely to be the suggested culprit. Do you guys want to take any guesses at
I've got one
some of those 8?
based on some of the stuff I've been reading about 9/11.
Go for it.
Israel.
Israel's not on there, I'm afraid.
Not on there.
I was just gonna. This is based on very, very little, but I'm just gonna say China.
Correct.
Oh,
Hey.
well, there we go. Time to shut the podcast down.
So from lowest to highest, the 8 are Hong Kong, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Norway, Canada, the United Arab Emirates, and top of the list is China. Maybe the Canadians were out for revenge after the War of 1812. So yeah, this is especially fishy when, as Calum mentioned earlier, under the official narrative, Saudi Arabia are believed to have financed the attack. So if this story is true, then one of those 8 countries have benefited financially from the 9/11 terror attack. And I mean, considering it was placed the day before, that is very suspicious indeed. So what do you guys think about this one?
I think in the face of what you'd hope would be very little information leaking about a terrorist attack, that's suspicious enough for me because this isn't really my area of expertise, to say the least, but I was trading. But it's very interesting, that's for sure. Just think of some guy in his hedge fund has bet a lot of money, so effectively against a growing market, and to wake up the next day and see planes crashing into the Twin Towers, thinking, all my chickens have come home to roost in a good way.
Yeah, the patterns are very strange for sure. Obviously, patterns can happen when news is released, but you always expect the markets to react very quickly. So for the patterns to happen over the space of a month, it definitely kind of seemed like something was up in a way and some people knew something.
It might not seem suspicious, you say, stuff happening before the event, because if you were to believe that no one knew anything of what was going on, apart from, say, the FBI, so if anyone's got the actual the intelligence on potential terrorist attacks, it could just be, if you're being really, say, naive and just believing exactly what you're told, it's just some traders got very lucky.
Very lucky indeed.
But the fact that, say, my theory implied in prior government knowledge, you've also mentioned government knowledge maybe been leaking information to a certain trader.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess this theory kind of suggests that there could have been the government leaking it to a trader, or equally, it could have been the Saudi Arabians trying to finance the attack itself by, sticking one massive middle finger up to America and using their US Treasury notes to fund it themselves.
Basically paying for the attack and then making a profit off the top of it as well, most likely.
It's genius. Yeah, so do you guys want to give me some ratings for the believability?
I think in terms of the conspiracy as a whole, it's a great conspiracy. Just as an overall picture that government or maybe somebody else could allow it to happen for financial gain, and then the fact that there seems to be, a hell of a lot of evidence in the trading to suggest that at least some people had some kind of foreknowledge. So yeah, I think overall I'm going to give the conspiracy an 8. In terms of believability, as you kind of touched on, I think it is possible somebody had a bit of a masterstroke and was just lucky and was maybe looking at the right trends at the right times, because people do make billions off kind of big risks and getting a bit lucky like that. But it's quite a coincidence. I think probably too much of a coincidence to leave it as a coincidence. In terms of, as you say, options trading is normally a reasonably low risk, and consequently, compared to kind of say call options, it's a bit less reward. But I think overall, I don't know, there seems to be a hell of a lot of information on it, backing it, especially the fact there's Bloomberg chart, things like that.
There's also published papers on this, published economic journal papers.
Yeah, well, there you go. It sounds like the investigation into the actual people making the trades was a bit wishy-washy and kind of brushed under the carpet. I think in terms of giving a believability thing, it's quite difficult because there's a lot to unpack, because you could take a few different angles. You could say it was the US government that were aware it was going to happen, and because they were the ones planning the attack, so they profited out of it. You could say it was actually just the terrorists themselves making the bets, or people doing it on their behalf. Then you can bring in China and say, well, maybe it was they knew something about it. But I think in terms of approaching it maybe a bit more broadly, in the sense that somebody got wind that it was going to happen and let on to some traders or did some trading themselves in order to benefit out of it, I think it's quite hard to argue with that, just based on the figures. Like you say, 100 times more activity on the options for those specific airlines that were involved. It's a bit all too convenient. So I think overall, if you take the theories, kind of some people having foreknowledge around the incident and then trading in order to benefit themselves, I think I might go as high as a 7 out of 10 for believability.
Lovely stuff. What about you, Calum?
Keep my thoughts a little more brief just because I'm less informed on the whole matter. It's a very good conspiracy, I'll start off by saying that much. Just almost a cheek of either the government informing those on the trading, a couple of the few people on the trading floor to recoup some of the losses they might be projecting had they planned it, and seeing like there's going to be an economic crash, you need to get just a bit more money back in the treasury. But yeah, from an actual trading standpoint, it could be from outside forces a la Saudi Arabia. That is just very, very cheeky, I'll say that much. I suppose you say it's low risk options as well, so you could think maybe someone just trying to make the deal of their lifetime. So right, I'm shoving it all on red, essentially. Ramp everything we've got on this stock, and I hope for a miracle. Not to just like 9/11 is a miracle, but purely from a money-making standpoint.
I've never heard 9/11 described as a miracle before.
The unexpected on the Co-Conspirators podcast. So, but yeah, I'll go overall conspiracy. I'll give it an 8. And I think the believability, the fact that it was a very, as John said, a very wishy-washy investigation, sort of just like, we didn't really see any evidence, not we could press the issue any further. The guy didn't look like any links to al-Qaeda or any other organisations. Combined with all the other information that's mentioned, I'll give it a solid 6.5. So it's quite believable as things go, these conspiracies go.
Yeah, in terms of an overall conspiracy for me, like as an economic student, it was quite a fun one to research, and by no means a trading expert and not really involved in trading at all, but looking from an economic, just looks so strange. And there's multiple explanations for it. It touches on Saudi Arabia doing it. It touches on the US government doing it. So I find it quite interesting in that respect. And I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10 for a conspiracy. In terms of believability, it kind of depends what aspect you want to look at. If you want to look at the American government doing it or the Saudi Arabian government trading, I think I'd probably score under a 5. But in terms of someone out there having a bit of insider knowledge that, potentially could have been passed on to a hedge fund, whether that be a member of al-Qaeda themselves or someone just somewhere coming upon some knowledge, I find that pretty believable, to be honest, especially with the very, very unique trading patterns. And I think just one unique trading pattern could kind of kickstart more trading patterns as financial analysts look at the market and see them trading patterns and then themselves invest. And that's kind of how like speculation and bubbles work. So for that, I'm actually going to give it a 7.5 out of 10 on believability. And yeah, that wraps up our last conspiracy. Calum, have you got a classic game of a conspiracy for us all to play?
I have indeed. From one form of speculation to maybe a slightly less risky form, good old game of conspiracy to wrap things up around 9/11, which I will preface by saying it's quite difficult to make up a conspiracy theory about 9/11 because there's so many out there.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So I came up with a couple I thought were quite novel, did this research, turns out, nope, they've already been done, so...
These better be pretty wacky then, if you couldn't even make some up.
But before we get into it, I'll just quickly give a run through. So me, as the host, it's my job to present 3 theories about the conspiracy we're dealing with, in this case 9/11, 2 of which are genuine and have been found somewhere on the internet, and 1 is made up completely by me, and it's my co-host's job to pick out the conspiracy, which is the one that I made up. Shall we get into it?
Let's go.
Do it.
Right, number 1. The 1985 film Back to the Future predicted 9/11.
Fair play.
Number 2, Israeli agents posed as art students were tasked with rigging the buildings with demolition explosives, supporting the angle that Israel was involved in the motive to destroy the Twin Towers. Number 3, the Twin Towers were destroyed as part of a Satanist plot to amplify Western religious tensions.
God.
Right. Do you want to give us a bit of background on the first one, about how Back to the Future predicted it?
Yeah, well, I will preface this by saying that Back to the Future is my favourite film of all time. A few things in there that allegedly suggest that they predicted 9/11. First one is that the beginning of the film shows the Twin Pine Mall, but at the end, because of Marty's interventions in the future, and hence the past as well, it's now the Lone Pine Mall, which is a representation of the Twin Towers being replaced by the single Freedom Tower. And also, at this mall, a terrorist attack takes place, perpetrated by Middle Eastern terrorists.
All right. Do you want to move on to the art students one? So what are you going to say about this? They were carrying in paintings to put on the wall that were actually explosives.
Not quite, no.
All right, go on.
The key piece of evidence about this one is that one of the art installations that they were working on was to do with illuminating certain rooms in the Twin Tower to spell out a phrase. This phrase was E-Team, which was the name of their art group. This highlighted area was suspiciously close to the area where one of the planes struck. While some believe that E-Team was an overt reference to explosives team, interpreted as Mossad flaunting their plan to the unsuspecting Americans.
When you say it lit it up, as in guiding the plane in?
No, so each one has a big floor-to-ceiling window. Putting the lights on in certain ones will spell out things across like several stories. But if you compare photos, it may or may not suggest that there is a big correlation between the area that was lit up and the place where the plane went in, if you believe a plane went in at all.
All right, and what was the last one?
Twin Towers destroyed as part of a Satanist plot.
Right, okay. Sounds interesting.
So, according to the writings of Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most famous cult practitioner and the poster child for Satanism, the numbers 9 and 11 represent the words evil and magic, respectively. So, a combination of the two indicates an act of evil magic. And the 11 in 9/11 consists of two wands, which symbolises duality. Likewise, the two towers represent duality, the symbol of God's creation. Flight 11 was the first plane to impact, highlighting the destruction of duality and, as a result, the destruction of God.
This is a really tough one because I feel
Yeah.
like pretty much any major conspiracy will have Satanism linked to it somehow, and also kind of Israel always gets linked to a lot of conspiracies. So you can probably kind of believe that someone would have made that up somewhere.
I'm struggling this week, I'll be honest, because I thought,
Yeah.
when you read them out, I thought I knew which one straight away.
Yeah.
And then when you explain them, I'm now not so sure.
Okay, I've got a bit more I can give away if you want some more.
What, on all of them?
Yeah, I've got a little bit more for each of them.
Right, go on. Give us a little bit more for all of them.
During the climax of the film, Marty McFly is shouting to Doc Brown, "I have to tell you about the future." While the clock tower is struck by lightning, shows the time 5 to 10, which on an analog clock, the hands points to the numbers 9 and 11.
Oh, coincidence.
Yeah, also, the logo of the Back to the Future franchise shows an arrow representing a plane flying into the letters K, which translates the number 2 in gematria, a form of alphanumeric code, thus representing the two towers.
Right, the art student one.
For the art students, there was pictures released of these supposed art students wearing climbing harnesses and cables, which some theorists believed were for the purpose of rigging explosives in the elevator shafts, which were also out of commission at the time of 9/11. It's been widely reported that several elevators weren't working.
And final one.
Final one. This is also maybe sort of icing on the cake for this one. On the 11th of September 2001, prominent metal band Slayer, who have been well known for their links to the occult and Satanism, written many songs, been said in interviews they read the Satanic Bible, blah, blah, released the album God Hates Us All, coinciding with the destruction of the towers. The cover art features 4 crosses that looks like the silhouettes of the airliners, foreshadowing the 4 hijacked planes. And also, just a little bit more information. Some of the tracks on this album include titles such as Darkness of Christ, God Send Death, New Faith, Cast Down, Warzone, Here Comes the Pain, and Payback. So I think there's several links there to the events that would unfold as a result of 9/11 and the fallout.
So he's definitely got a lot of detail on his.
He does. You can go first. Well, I know what I'm going to get, but I want to hear what you say.
I'm actually going to let you go first.
Very diplomatic.
Right, when you first read them out, I thought it was going to be the art one was made up.
Yeah.
Then when you explained them the first time, I thought it was the Back to the Future one. Then when you explained them the second time, I now think it's the last one. At one point, I've stumped through all 3. I think the Back to the Future one, first I was drawn to thinking you would have made it up because you like the film so much.
Yeah.
But there's a hell of a lot in it. I'm just going to go, I think the occult one you made up.
Okay. Luke, what about you? What do you think?
So the reason I wanted John to go first is because I'm also a huge Back to the Future fan, and I've seen the video that describes the conspiracy suggesting that Back to the Future predicted 9/11. So
all right, so maybe made your life a bit easier.
I mean, I just think there's going to be links to Satanism and 9/11 for sure. So I feel like that would be a real conspiracy. And at the same time, I know there's not a lot of anti-Semitic kind of feeling towards 9/11, and you wouldn't be surprised if conspiracies about Israel came out. But I do think I'm going to go for the Israeli art students is the one you've made up, Calum.
Right. Well, I can reveal that one of you is correct, and it's also a win for conspiracy.
Yeah, that's what we always like to see.
Exactly. So to put you out of your misery, John is correct. He correctly identified that I made up the Satanist ritual plot.
Gutted.
But there's actually quite a lot to read in about these supposed Israeli art students. It's one of those ones, it takes a lot bit getting your head around because there's a lot of evidence suggests there were over 200 individuals that were performing various, I'll say, tasks that were alerting the suspicions of the DEA and the FBI from sort of visiting restricted areas of the World Trade Center or attempting to.
Blimey.
Were they also telling the traders in the World Trade Center to have a cheeky bet?
I wouldn't put it past them, I'd put it that way, if they were the ones potentially rigging the explosives as well. As for the third one, I mean, there's obviously been lots of links to Satanism, but this one, focusing on Slayer, I think is a little bit beyond the realms of possibility.
Are you familiar with that album? Have you listened to it?
I've listened to some of the songs on it.
Because that was kind of what I was thinking. Well, I know you quite like that kind of music.
Yeah.
So maybe you're familiar with that album and you were able to make that leap between the two.
Yeah, it's also the fact it was just released on the 9/11, and sort of a tenuous link between the albums, which basically 4 crosses were something like inverted crosses, looking a bit like planes. Just trying to thought, if you do look really deep, there's a couple of things that make some really much deeper links towards Satanism, like all the different ways numbers are combined, and how you can find 666 from 9/11 and stuff. But
yeah. Well, I think that was probably the best game of conspiracy we've had so far. And I'm not just saying that because I won.
All right.
I thought the level of detail on all of them was brilliant.
High praise indeed. I must say, I did spend quite a lot of time pondering what to do.
Definitely set a new standard.
I think I've returned to my previous efforts as well, which would be less difficult to deduce. I'll say that much.
The one about Wigan springs to mind.
Yeah, that one. I think that was only the second podcast.
Think of that.
But yeah, so there we have it. Potentially the first podcast we could do on 9/11, because realistically, we've barely scratched the surface on all the different conspiracies that there is to offer about one of the most monumentous days in, say, recent history.
In world history. We get, a lot of support on this video, and it's a popular one, which hopefully it will be, then we'll definitely look at doing a second part to it, going a bit deeper.
Yeah, just so long as YouTube doesn't shut us down, because we've been having a little bit of success recently. We're seeing some good numbers, both on the YouTube channel and on Apple Podcasts, on Anchor as well. We've got, you name the podcast format, we'll be on there. So whatever you choose to prefer to listen to, check us out.
Yeah, just again, as Calum kind of mentioned then, just want to say a huge thank you, because our last 2 videos have done a lot better than I think any of us thought that they would this early on. So yeah, thanks for the support.
Keep it coming. Keep suggestions coming. Got anything you'd like us to talk about? We're very open-minded on the Co-Conspirators podcast. We're happy to do any research, any conspiracy theory that might take your interest, and we hopefully learn a thing or two. But yeah. I will bid you farewell and say goodbye from the 2 co-hosts as well.
See you in the next one.
And keep challenging the status quo.